get engaged in something. So the idea that there are people who are not engaged fits right in for what they're thinking about as being good, right? And so they established a task force, like all their other, like the housing task force, that they called their community building task force. Right? And why did they call it community building? Because in their view, what builds a community is an ever-growing number of people who are contributing their gifts, capacities, skills, etc., to the community's life. So they weren't looking at disability or mental illness or homelessness. They were looking at people who weren't participating. And if they were going to participate, they didn't want them just to come to meetings, and that's not really participating. They wanted them to contribute. So they'd have to figure out what they had to offer and connect them where that offering would be of value to the community. So they had a task force of 5 people. None of them knew anything about, quote, disabilities. In fact, it turns out none of them even had a close family member. But they were neighborhood people, like a postman, a teacher assistant, a person who had a little beauty parlor, 5 people like that. And they had a little money in the organization. And so they hired one person they knew was a connector to work with all these other 5 people. So they had a connectors table of 6 people. And the person they hired as the connector is probably one of the 2 greatest connectors I have ever met in my life. Her name is Rosita Della Rosa. I love that name, Little Rose of the Rose.
She was at your birthday party.
Pardon?
She was at your birthday party.
Yeah. A woman who makes offers you cannot refuse. But what was her background? She was a receptionist at the hospital. Right. And so in that sense, she was about the business of knowing people, meeting them, dealing with them. And before that, she had been the manager of 2 apartment buildings.
Mm-hmm.
She graduated from high school, had no college. She had 7,438,000 relatives in the neighborhood. So that's who's at the center of this deal. And so they began to meet people and try to figure out what their gifts were. And I'm going to show you at the end of the first year, they had connected about 40 people. And at the annual meeting, they made their report, like each of the task forces did. And these are pictures from there that they presented at the annual meeting that I'm using. Stole. First person they met was a fellow whose name was Eddy. And there he is.
Well,
Oh, wait. There you go. That's Eddy. And I'm going to tell this to you. After 2 years, we were supposed to do evaluations. I talked to all these people. And I'm going to tell you about this in their language and their way. Because that's essential. And they said, Eddy, you could see what Eddy's gift, you didn't even have to talk to him. Mm-hmm. And they thought, when they're around him, that he was the most joyous person, the happiest, joyful person I ever met. Eddy is like this all the time. And if that weren't enough, fills a room with his joy, with his he talks like this all the time too. So when Eddie's around, you know he's there. Right? And so they said, where would people really value a joyful person? Right? Because the key to community is your kid. And they said, we thought about that. In fact, we made a list of the most unjoyful places in Logan Square. Isn't that wonderful? And I asked them what it was, and they said the police station, unjoyful place. The hospital was an unjoyful place. The high school was an unjoyful place. 43% of the kids drop out every year, graduate from it, must be pretty bad. And they went on. But they decided to start at the hospital. That they would see if there's something, that if at the hospital they would value a joyful person, since people were not joyful to come to the hospital, and could use some joy. And was there something Eddie would like to do himself? So there was a mutuality. And so they went to the local hospital, and this is the local hospital. The last Norwegian left Logan Square in 1990. They never changed the name. Poles moved into the neighborhood. And after the Second World War, the Poles moved out, and the Hispanics began to come in. Right? But it's Norwegian American Hospital. And the administrator's name is Jose Lopez, right, of Norwegian American Hospital. This is a wonderful shift is what's happened. And so 2 of the members of the task force went with Eddie to see the hospital administrator, Lopez. Can you picture this? And they're proposing that Eddie be there, sharing his joy. Can you imagine a hospital administrator? What? Because I interviewed him later, and he thought it was just out of this world. I mean, that they were crazy, right? And they said, what we'd like to do is explore the hospital and see if there are things here that Eddie would like to do, and see if his joy is something people like. And Lopez told me, he said, I never would have agreed to it, but they came from the neighborhood organization, Power. And I couldn't afford to mess around with them, right? Because that's my patients are. Right? So he says, will you be with him all the time? And they said yes. And so they began then to explore the hospital with him. And after a couple days, he decided that where he liked the best was the operating room. And so they went back to Lopez, and Lopez says he can't be in the operating room. The Board of Health doesn't allow anybody who's not certified professional in the operating room. So then they spent more time, and Eddie came across, he didn't like the offices because people could sit there. And only people who are mentally disabled can stand sitting in an office and typing. Right? He's above that. He couldn't. He's too much a real person to do that, right? So he noticed that there was a person who was a volunteer who came every day and delivered the departmental mail to each department. And he liked it because that person moved all through the hospital on each floor, and they got to wear vests. And Eddie's a pretty self-important person, and so he likes that, right? And so they decided, well, maybe this is something he should try. But Eddy doesn't read, right? So the question is, how could you make a mailman with somebody who doesn't read? And they solved that by putting an animal sticker on each one of the departmental envelopes that had the mail in it. So like the pediatrics department might have an elephant on it. And then at the pediatrics department where the administrative assistant was for that department, or the administrator, clerical person, they put the elephant sticker there so that Eddy could match the things.
The system had the use for something.
Pardon?
System had use for something.
Oh, yeah, that's right. Yeah. Yes, yeah. So he began to go up and down the hall delivering the mail to the various departments. And as soon as he got comfortable with that, he began to look in the rooms, talk to people, because he's the most garrulous person you've ever. And of course, this is where the joy could be manifested. And so he would walk down the hall, and he began to say, he'd look in the room, and he'd say, "Hi, I'm Eddy. Who are you?" Right? And you would answer,
I'm Ellen. How are you?
no, he'd say, "I'm Ellen." And then he would say, "How are you doing?" He said, he says this to everybody, those very words. "Hi, I'm Eddy. How you doing?" Right? And so you've just come out of intensive care. You've had your gallbladder removed, right? You're feeling terrible, right? And you say, as most people would, you say to Eddy, "Not feeling very good, Eddy." And Eddy responds the same. He has it's a ritual in his mind, I guess. He'd say, "Well, good." And then he leaves and he goes to the next room, says the same thing. Right? Now, the head nurse is telling me this, right? She says, so Eddy comes around the next day to you, and he remembers your name. Somebody's labeled him, but he can remember the names of 114 people in the hospital after learning it one day. And he says, "Hi," tell me your name. "Hi, Ellen, how you doing?" And head nurse says, "This is the most therapeutic moment every person faces in this hospital, because they know, just by the ritual way he does it, what he's going to answer," right? And she says he tips them all, so you'll say something like, "Well, I'm feeling better, Eddy," and he'll say, "Good." Right? And so this goes on over and over again, you know. And
wow.
you can just imagine how this will begin to affect people who are there. And then he becomes more confident, because he's a really self-confident person. And he begins walking up and down the aisles and saying, "Mailman, mailman," you know, so he knows he's coming or waiting for him. He fills the place with a completely different idea of what life is about. And so that became his basic activity. Here he is with a couple of employee of the hospital and her son. Look at their faces. You see what he does? He's like that all the time. And he has that effect on people. So in the evaluation, I'm talking to Lopez, and I say to Lopez, "Well, how do you view Eddy now? Is it not a job? Not a job. Everything they did was not focused on being a job. It's focused on creating an environment of contribution and gifts. If something called a job developed out of it, then that would be possible. But when you start with jobs, you immediately narrow the possibilities of really having somebody's gift be yours. That's what I've really learned out of this. I'm not against jobs, but Eddie's one of a group of people who they didn't think they could get a job in the group home where he was. So at any rate, Lopez says to me, he says, I don't see him much because I'm on the 8th floor, and the departments are all on the other 7 floors, so he's down there delivering the mail. He says, but, he says, 2 things I can tell you about him. He says, and the first is that we have about 700 some employees, and about 5 to 7% are absent every day. So he said maybe 35 to 50 people are absent every day. He says, and every once in a while, Eddie doesn't come. He said, Eddie doesn't have to come any day. But he says, if Eddie doesn't come, I get 4 or 5 phone calls. Where's Eddie? He says, that day, there are 40 people who aren't there. I get no calls. So it really stands out in my mind. There is only one person I know in this hospital who people care enough, they'll call me up and ask about, and it's Eddie. Right. So, and then he said, another thing, he smiled, another thing he has done, he says, is, you know, he has this thing with those animals that help him deliver the mail. He says, but he screws up all the time. He says he doesn't get it right. So he delivers the pediatric mail to the gynecology department, right? And he says, so I've learned that what happens is that the person in the gynecology department goes over to the administrator of the person in the pediatrics department, says, I got your mail, do you have mine? Right? They talk with each other and know each other. And he says, so after he's been there a year, he says, every year we have an in-service training for 1 day on trying to promote interdepartmental communication. He said, we have 17 departments, and it's just like they're all, what do you call it, silos. He says, and Eddie, he says, has broken that down. He says, if you do it every year, it makes no difference at all. And then we call the next year's day on interdepartmental communication. Everybody comes, they all know each other, right? And this is a whole new set of relationships. He says, so I'm asking, how did you what's happened here? And what's happened is Eddie. And then the other thing, the head nurse, when I talked with her about it, she said, listen, he's the most important person in the hospital. She says, we have about 70 doctors, but we only have 1 healer. And that's it.
You know, John, what's so powerful about that?
Yeah.
It's not just Eddie. So Eddie's existed for this forever. It was how Lopez saw it.
Yes. Yeah, right. No,
I mean, it's,
yeah.
So the listener,
Yeah.
the connector,
Yeah.
and then when the story got told, people understood it, the celebrators.
Yes, that's true. That's true.
John, can I? Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, his narrow little life up there in that one room, right, allowed him in a funny way to see what I think a lot of other people wouldn't have seen, because he could see the exception to the mundane, everyday rules of his life. Yeah.
Yeah. Can I just put